Right. And we are live, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. For those joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. And of course, there are no classrooms right now. All of you guys are stuck at home, so we so appreciate you joining us as we continue to highlight amazing scientists and explorers from across the globe on YouTube, and today and this week, live from home. So we have got Miss Shelton's class joining us from Benicia, California. So welcome to the whole Shelton crew. And we've got Miss Michael's group from Glenview, Illinois. So it's so nice having two live classes on, so many excited students, and I really appreciate you being here. Today, we are continuing our epic SciComm Storytime series. So every single day at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific, we have been featuring the all-stars of science communication. Everything from flying into hurricanes to diving into brains and so much more. I encourage you to check them all out on our YouTube page. But today, we are joined live in lovely San Francisco by Ariel Waldman, who, as people have been, came on before we went live, have seen, has done so many things that I can barely even keep track of it. But she is an author of amazing books. She's been on Adam Savage's tested program. She led a 5-week expedition to Antarctica to film microscopic life under the ice. Many of you might not even know there was microscopic life under the ice, but Ariel might get a chance to tell us about that today. So many fantastic programs in her career highlighting the amazing and wide world of science. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us today, Ariel, and take us away.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope you all can hear me okay. Yeah, so it's just really exciting to be able to come into all of your homes during this time and just geek out about stuff. As was being said, I've done quite a lot of different things, but I have a fairly unusual background that really shows that you can do multiple different types of things in your life. So I guess without further ado, I will share my screen and turn it over to my presentation. And I've got a bunch of pictures and videos and stuff to share and talk you through about a little bit about my life and how I got to Antarctica and NASA and all sorts of things like that. All right, it looks like I am sharing my screen now. So this is one of my favorite pictures that I always love to start with. I love this picture so much because it's taken from one of my favorite spacecrafts, Voyager 1. And if you can see that tiny little pale blue speck of a pixel there in that orange beam, that's actually Earth as seen from 4 billion miles away. So I always joke that that's where you can find me if you need me. But the thing that I really love about pictures like these is that they show us how space exploration often changes our view of ourselves and our place in the universe. But a lot of my work focuses on changing how we view space exploration and science. And there's just so many incredible things to explore. So even though a lot of my work is in space exploration and science, I actually don't come from a science background. I went to art school. So my degree is actually in graphic design. I went to art school, I did graphic design, I took lots of drawing classes, and I was really into art. It wasn't that I disliked science, but I was just more passionate about art when I was growing up and still passionate about it to this day. So my background doesn't really match up to what people often think of as people who work in the sciences, but the reality is that there are people from all different disciplines who can contribute to science. So my story really began when I was watching a documentary called When We Left Earth. For any kids or parents out there who are wanting to watch like a cool documentary about what it took for NASA to launch humans into space for the very first time, When We Left Earth is a really incredible documentary. And I was watching this documentary at home and they were interviewing a lot of the guys who used to work in mission control in the 1960s, a long time ago. But all of the people that were working at NASA in the early days were talking about how they didn't know anything about space exploration or rockets or orbits or spacecrafts. And I was saying to myself, well, I don't know anything about space exploration and I want to work at NASA. That sounds amazing. And so I decided on a whim to send someone at NASA an email, someone I had never met. And I just told them that I was a huge fan of their work. And if they ever needed someone like me, someone completely without a science background, that I was here. Serendipitously, I ended up getting a job at NASA from that email, and it changed my life. This is what it felt like. It was just incredible. it was like, in a sense, getting paid to go to school. Getting to work at NASA means you get to learn about all sorts of things. And it was just so unexpected to be able to get a job at NASA from emailing someone. And it turns out NASA and many other science institutions need help from all sorts of people. So it really changed my relationship from viewing NASA as a bunch of rocket scientists who know every single thing in the world and they're so smart, and how could they like not know everything, to viewing them instead as like space hackers, people who were figuring things out as they went along, people who didn't have all the answers, but they were able to get answers to things by collaborating with people from different disciplines and backgrounds. So they're not know-it-alls, but they're actually people who are really good at collaborating with others to figure out answers. So really it changed my life because it was around this concept that doing something changes how you see it. So actually playing around with science and playing around with space exploration changes your relationship with it from something of observation, of something only other people do, to something of contribution and participation and something that you can add to. So one of the important things that I ended up learning while I was at NASA was that I didn't need to be an astronaut in order to explore space. And so that was a really profound realization for me, that there were many ways to explore space. And so as I learned about new different ways to explore space, about a decade ago, I guess over a decade ago, I created spacehack.org, which is a directory of ways for anyone to participate in space exploration with or without a formal science background. This website was definitely ahead of its time, but it's still up and running. If you are interested in different ways in which you could participate in space exploration or contribute to space exploration, definitely go check that out. Another thing that I created a few years later was that after meeting a lot of astronauts and getting to work with some astronauts, I learned about all of the kind of funny, awkward, silly stories about what it's like to actually go to space. And I wrote a book called What's It Like in Space? Stories from Astronauts Who've Been There. It's a short and sweet book, but it's kind of asking astronauts to talk about some of the more embarrassing stories that they have about their time in space. And to me, this makes space exploration a little bit more relatable, because oftentimes we view astronauts as, again, knowing everything and having it all figured out. But the reality is that many of them are just like us and have to have embarrassing or awkward or silly or funny moments in space. So another option to check out if you're into getting new books while you all are staying at home. So finally, I did a lot of work at NASA and did a lot of work in space exploration generally. But as I got more interested in space, I got more interested in sort of exploring what places on Earth are like places in outer space, because I'm not anticipating that I'm necessarily going to be an astronaut any day. But I wanted to sort of figure out what my version of going to space was, what my extreme was. And I landed on Antarctica, because Antarctica is so far away and cold and isolated. There's so many aspects of Antarctica that are like space exploration. Some parts are like the Martian surface, other parts are like an icy moon in our solar system, like Europa or Enceladus, these icy moons that may, for all we know, host life. It's something that we're definitely wanting to explore as time goes on. But I really wanted to go to Antarctica. But I didn't want to just go to Antarctica as a tourist. I wanted to go to Antarctica to be with all the nerds, all the scientists who are in Antarctica, who are doing a bunch of interesting work. But as all of you know, as I've introduced, I don't have a formal science background. So even though I had sort of unexpectedly stumbled my way into working at NASA, I needed to figure out how I could go to Antarctica without being a scientist, but as someone who wanted to contribute to science. So the National Science Foundation had a program called the Antarctic Artists and Writers Program, which sends artists to Antarctica to explore and do a lot of amazing artwork that also really helps bridge the gap between art and science and the nature of Antarctica. But even though I went to art school and got my degree in graphic design, I'm terrible at drawing. So this picture of this woman here who's just drawing in the middle of Antarctica, I couldn't do that because my drawing skills are just terrible. But as all of this should hopefully illustrate, not having the best skills in any given area shouldn't really defeat you from really wanting to explore. So I talked to a lot of scientists about what sorts of things they would like to see from Antarctic artists and what sorts of things would be helpful both for art and science. And I learned that actually there's a lack of microscopy in science in Antarctica. So microscopy is just using microscopes to look at tiny forms of life. And so it turns out, even though all these Antarctic scientists are going down there and they are able to tell us what forms of life live down there, they almost take no pictures or no videos of this life. It's not necessary for their science to do that, but it would be incredibly beneficial to their science to take pictures and videos of the life that lives in Antarctica, because there's a lot of scientific findings you can come across by actually just observing life. This is very similar to going to zoos or places in parks or the outdoors where you can observe different types of wildlife actually, having interesting behaviors. So the thing that's really fascinating about this is that when most people think of Antarctica, they think of a place that's barren and lifeless, except for a few penguins. But the reality is that there's actually tons of life in Antarctica. It's just too tiny to see. So you have all this invisible life, tiny animals, tiny plants, tiny creatures all over living underneath the ice, but you wouldn't know it because it's hard to see. And without using a microscope, no one can see it. So I decided that was where I was going to help a bunch of scientists. So I began teaching myself how to use microscopes over a number of years. And then I went to a community college to get certified as a microscopist. And eventually I actually was able to get this grant to go to Antarctica about a year ago. This is a picture of me at a community college here in Oakland called Merritt College. They have a microscopy program where you can get certified as a microscopist. And microscopists can be useful for many different science disciplines or for just doing interesting art. So microscopy is a really great discipline where you can merge art and science together. So after 5 years of trying to get this grant to go to Antarctica, it was a lot of work, I finally was able to go. And I was sent down there on a military aircraft, and it had no windows except for this very tiny window right here that you can see. And this was my very first time I got to see Antarctica with my own eyes. It was out this very tiny, tiny window. And it was just magical to be able to see this. And I don't know, I still struggle to put it into words, just how amazing it is to see this continent that very few people get to go to, and is just so extreme in cold and in dryness. So a lot of times when we talk about Antarctica, we know that it's a place that's very cold, but it's also a desert. And so in addition to being very cold, it's incredibly dry. It's a polar desert. So the places I got to explore in Antarctica to film life that lives underneath the ice are a few different places. This picture here is a picture of the sea ice in Antarctica. So the sea ice in Antarctica is the ice that sits on top of the ocean, not on top of the land. And every year, the sea ice during the winter actually doubles the entire size of Antarctica. Antarctica is nearly the size of North America, which is really, really huge. So a lot of people don't think about the size of Antarctica, but it's the size of perhaps the United States and Mexico combined, more or less. So this sea ice actually doubles the size of Antarctica, and that little orange building that you can see there, that's actually a fish hut, which is not used for fishing anymore, but it's used for divers to actually dive in underneath the sea ice. And this is what it looks like inside that little fish hut. There's actually a carved out hole in that fish hut, and they keep it warm so that the divers have a hole that they can return to every day and dive in. The sea ice, when I took this picture, was probably around 9 feet thick. And the water below is, I think, around 72 feet deep. And the water, I think, was -2 degrees Celsius. So it's actually below the standard freezing point for water, but because it's salt water, it wasn't frozen, but it's still so incredibly cold. So it's actually below freezing level for water. And so you can imagine being a diver, diving down into that is a really big feat. So The thing that's exciting though is that you don't have to be a diver in order to go under the sea ice. They have this metal tube that you can see here inserted into the 9 feet thick sea ice, and you can go down like you're a little Mario, video game, go down into this pipe and crawl underneath the 9 feet thick ice, and then actually be able to go underneath the sea ice and see it there. I'm trying to see if my video, let's see. This is what it looks like when you're on the bottom of that. So you crawl down this metal pipe underneath the sea ice, and now you're in this sort of metal cage with these windows. And so what you see at the top is the illuminated sea ice, and all those little dots, those are fish. So those are fish just swimming around, having a great life. And so you're kind of suspended between the sea ice and the sea floor, and it's just absolutely magical. So there's a way in which you can essentially become an Antarctic diver without necessarily getting as cold as they do. It was cold in this metal tube, but not as cold as being a diver. So this is what this looks like from the outside. So this is that metal tube called the observation tube, and that's me in it, suspended between the sea ice and the sea floor. And you can take cool selfies with divers, as you can see. It was a magical experience to be able to do that. This metal tube was actually originally developed for scientists to be able to study fish and other creatures underneath the ice. So that's another interesting career to consider, is just being suspended in a metal tube in the ocean for days at a time so that you can study fish. So the sorts of microscopic creatures that I was able to find in the sea floor and in the sea ice were things like this. This is a diatom, which is literally a microscopic shell of glass. So this is a glass structure created by a living organism. And inside these glass structures is just single-celled algae. So if you've seen algae in ponds, this is a type of algae that has a glass shell around it. And they come in all sorts of different patterns and shapes and sizes. And they're really beautiful to consider. And they're really common all over the Antarctic Ocean. Other things I saw were things like creepy little shrimp that live in Antarctica, which are creepy but delightful to look at. And this is a seed shrimp. So this little dude is a seed shrimp, which is just beautiful, has these beautiful little frilly arms, as you can see, and those are also really common around Antarctica. So other places I got to go in Antarctica were places like Blood Falls, which is a really incredible looking place that has this red gushing stuff coming out of it. And what's actually happening is that there's iron underneath a glacier nearby. And when that iron comes out of that glacier and spurts out to the top, it becomes iron oxide. Essentially, the iron hits oxygen and it creates that red color. For a long time, they thought maybe this red color was algae, but they discovered that in fact it's iron oxide. But the interesting thing about this is that they thought this area called Blood Falls had no life in it whatsoever. But in the last decade, they've been able to establish that actually there's tons of bacteria that live in Blood Falls. So another example of extreme organisms that are able to survive in Antarctica. So this is a picture of me in Antarctica with my 2 microscopes. The one microscope on the left is actually the microscope that is on my left today in my science studio. I had a very tiny space to look at all these micro creatures, but it was a sufficient amount of space to be able to just look for all these different interesting creatures in Antarctica. So another place I was able to go to was actually hiking up a glacier in Antarctica. Antarctica has these beautiful glaciers like this one. This one is known as Canada Glacier. And I've never hiked up a glacier before in my life. I'm not a very athletic person personally. And so I didn't know if I was going to be able to do this, but thankfully I had a team of researchers who were helping me, and I was able to actually get on top of the glacier. I just took my time and went very slow. The whole reason of why to get on top of a glacier to look for microbes, though, is interesting because essentially if you drill into a glacier in Antarctica like this, you'll actually find that there are microorganisms and tiny animals living inside the glacier. actually inside. So what we did is we actually drilled into this glacier, and we were able to get this ice core, but importantly, at the bottom of the ice core is a dirt puck. And these dirt pucks are all over the glacier. There's the ice core you can see coming out. In a moment, you'll see the dirt puck. There's the dirt puck. That dirt puck is full of tiny animals, tiny plants, tiny bacteria, all sorts of creatures living in that. And they are just having a great time living inside a glacier. So this is definitely an extreme example of animals and plants and creatures that live in Antarctica that are just buried underneath the ice. It's really incredible. So some of the things that I found in that specific dirt puck that I just showed are things like this. This is a tardigrade, also known as a water bear. They're incredibly adorable. They're gummy bears with claws, essentially. And this tardigrade was found living in that dirt puck inside of that glacier. And it's just absolutely amazing to see. They're so, so cute and so just amazing. And as was being hinted earlier, I actually put out a video a week ago on Adam Savage's Tested on how you can actually find tardigrades in your own backyard or in your sidewalk cracks. So tardigrades, even though they're very hardy and known for being able to survive in places like Antarctica, they're actually all around you every day. Every time you see moss in a sidewalk or moss in your backyard or on a tree, there's likely tons of tardigrades in that moss. So that's one thing to keep in mind whenever you go outside and see moss, is that you're actually walking by like a zoo of tiny animals known as tardigrades. Other animals I found in that dirt puck were things like this. This is a rotifer. Rotifers are super weird. You'll see this one has like a little tiny foot on one end, and there it goes its crown, and that its crown is able to sweep in food into its mouth, sort of like a Roomba would sweep dust into its mouth. So rotifers are super weird little creatures that also live in Antarctica and all over the world. So all of this work really, to sort of begin summarizing it, is around the idea of breaking single narratives. For me, as I said, I started in art school, but then sort of stumbled into NASA and then figured out a way over many years to go to Antarctica. Sometimes things in your life happen haphazardly and unexpectedly, and you sort of just go with it. And other times, things like going to Antarctica, can take several years of work to actually go. But the important thing is that there's no one single way to get a job at NASA or to go to Antarctica or to do interesting science. There are many different ways. And for some of you, you might want to be a scientist as your full-time job. But for others of you, you might want to be an artist who just plays around with science occasionally. And the important thing to know is that you don't have to choose. You will face an incredible amount of pressure from people over your entire life to choose one single thing that you want to do. And while that makes sense in terms of, making a paycheck and getting an income and being stable, always remember that you don't have to turn away from things that you're interested in, and that you can choose to be interested in multiple things, and that's okay. And in fact, a lot of times you can become even more valuable in your job or in your career or in your life by being someone who knows how to translate between different areas like art and science, or someone who just is familiar with different areas where other people might not be. So it's really important to think about just never rejecting anything that you get interested in just because it maybe falls outside of something else that you're interested in. So a lot of my work is around this concept of massively multiplayer science, of getting people to collaborate in science and space exploration who come from different disciplines, so that we can build a better world where people don't have to necessarily choose one thing or another, that they can actually be valuable and collaborating with each other to make even better things happen in the world. One of the things I wanted to share with all of you is we can talk a little bit in the Q&A about how to find tardigrades around your own home. But if you don't have a microscope and you don't have access to buying a microscope, I recommend checking out lifeundertheice.org. It's a website of all of the different microbes that I was able to film while I was in Antarctica. And you can pan around and zoom in and out of all these different microbes and learn about them. And so if you don't have a microscope, essentially this gives you the feeling of what it's like to actually have a microscope in Antarctica and be able to look around for different microbes and go hunting for different microbes. And if you find microbes that you're interested in, you can share them and share them with friends and say, hey, did you see this microbe or this other one? So that's a really great way to have a virtual microscope in your web browser. So the website for that, again, is called lifeundertheice.org. Definitely check it out if you get a chance and share it with friends. There's a bunch of different microbes to go hunting for on that website. So it can definitely take up a good afternoon to try and find them all. With that, I think I'm just going to conclude and thank you all so much for your attention. And I think I'll switch over so that we can open up for Q&A. Let's see if I can stop sharing my screen here. All right, so I'm back in my science studio. That's my microscope I talked about. So thank you all so much. And then, yeah, happy to go into Q&A now.
Ariel, that was the coolest half hour ever. I mean, you covered most of my favorite things personally in science, and the fact that we have living Roombas and Mario tubes that go into the ice are pretty spectacular. Things that have never been featured before on Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, and we've done like 1,000 of these, so that's very, very cool. All right, in addition to our live groups, we've got 2 whole full classes. A few of you have already raised your hands through Zoom, so do that. That'll let me know that you guys have a question, and I'll come to you. For people tuning in on YouTube, just let me know where you're joining from, and I'll share as many questions as I can. So we're going to start with a question from Emily Calandrelli, who set this whole thing up, and is the thing you referenced in your Q&A. What kind of microscope do you need to see a tardigrade in moss, and how hard is it to do by yourself at home?
Yeah, so as I said, there's a video on Adam Savage's YouTube channel called Tested. Maybe you can drop a link to that in the chat at some point. So this video, you can also search for it, probably like Tested and tardigrades. It's actually fairly easy to search for tardigrades. You just need a little bit of patience. It's kind of like putting together a puzzle. It might take you a couple of hours, but you can definitely do it. So in terms of the types of microscopes you need, you can use cheap microscopes. There are cheap microscopes on Amazon that you can get. So any microscope that's like promoted as like a kid's microscope or something of that nature, if it's got good reviews on Amazon, I would go ahead and get it. I've seen some that are around $130 or so. Some are standalone microscopes, sort of like these, but others are ones that sort of clip onto your phone, like the U-Handy Mobile Duet has a high magnification lens that clips onto your phone that you can use. But I've seen a lot of other people using kids microscopes, again, around $130 or so, and they work totally fine. Essentially, tardigrades are around 1/4 millimeter big. They can be bigger, but a lot of the ones I find are 1/4 or 1/3 millimeter large. So if you have a microscope that can image that sort of size, then you'll be in business. The way in which you actually look for tardigrades is you go find moss anywhere you can. So in sidewalk cracks or in your backyard, and you dig up that moss and you soak it in water overnight. And then after you soak it in water overnight, you place it on top of a little like mesh screen, so something like you might have in your sink, or you use for like putting powdered sugar on your French toast or something, some sort of mesh strainer. And then you put just a couple of regular tissues on top of that, and then you put the moss on top of that. And that way you're able to actually soak, that's how you should soak the moss overnight. And then you get tardigrades who sort of fall through those tissues and fall through that strainer. And the next morning, you'll find that you have tardigrades in that water if you go searching for them with a microscope. Again, this will take you like a couple hours to a few hours because, you know, it takes a little bit of time to hunt for tardigrades, but it's something that anyone can do. And certainly I've done a very quick haphazard job of explaining it here, but my 10-minute video on Tested is a great explainer for how you can search for your own tardigrades. But again, if you don't have access to a microscope, or if you can't get access to a microscope, check out lifeundertheice.org, and that way you can find tardigrades and all sorts of other microbes using your web browser. And it really gives you the exact feel of what it's like to have a microscope and be searching for new microbes with it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ariel. All right. We're going to go to Owen first and then Connor on live on Zoom. So I'll come to you, Owen. Your mic should be unmuted, wants to unmute.
Yes.
So Owen, if you have a question, go right ahead, man.
What is the average temperature in Antarctica?
Good question. So I was in Antarctica during the summer. And in the summer, it's between 5 degrees Fahrenheit and maybe 20 degrees Fahrenheit while I was there. So a warm day in Antarctica is 20 degrees Fahrenheit, which is of course 12 degrees below freezing. But if there's no wind, then it feels really nice because you're like, oh, I don't have to wear my gloves today. That's great. Wind really is what affects the temperature the most. So it can be warmer or colder, but if there's just a hint of wind in Antarctica, that's when everything just feels so incredibly cold. But the thing that's exciting is that, 5 degrees to 20 degrees Fahrenheit in summer in Antarctica, some of you might know what that temperature feels like at home, because a lot of the Midwest and different areas all over the world, your winters might be between 5 degrees and 20 degrees Fahrenheit. So you may have actually experienced what Antarctic temperatures feel like in the summer.
Cool. Thank you so much. All right, let's head to Connor. Lily and Evangeline, you guys have both put up your hands. That's awesome. I'll take a few YouTube questions in the middle, but Connor, if you want to kick us off, go for it, man.
Yes, I do. So I'm wondering, if life is so cold and it's so deep, how can, I noticed in the video, you only drilled a bit down. Like, do you think there's gonna be like different life, like the more you go down? I'm hoping you can ride a dinosaur.
Awesome.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So yeah, that life in the glacier, those little dirt pucks of tiny animals that live in the glacier, those ones only live a foot or two deep in the glacier because they still need some access to sunlight. So they don't go much deeper than a couple of feet into the glacier so that they still get access to sunlight and can still use sunlight in a way for nutrients and other means. But there is life elsewhere in Antarctica that is deeper than in the glacier. And actually just this morning on my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Ariel Waldman, I just published this morning a video about where the deepest life in the entire Earth is. And it turns out that finding the deepest life in Earth is kind of difficult because there's many different definitions of deep. You can go deep underneath the sea floor or deep into the ocean or deep on land. But I talk about in that video that I just posted today about what the different examples of deep life are all over the world. So you might want to check that out.
That's what I really wanted. A shameless plug.
Fantastic, Connor. Nice shirt, by the way. I like the NASA shirt today. Way to go. All right, we're going to take a question from the Young family joining in on YouTube again. So welcome back to them. They want to ask Ariel, what is your favorite part of your job?
Favorite part? I mean, there's so many different aspects. Getting to actually go to different places and explore is really great. And exploring doesn't always have to be going far away, but just getting to explore, the ground around you or the trees around you or things of that nature are just really fascinating. But I think perhaps my favorite thing, as I said, is the fact that I've been able to navigate and, figure out over time how to do all the different things that I enjoy doing. So, we're in my little science studio now, but like this poster behind me is a poster that I designed. That's some of my, design and artwork. But I also have a microscope. And so for me, it's really exciting to know that any new things that I get interested in over time are things that I can explore or at least share my excitement with people about. So for me, I think the best part is not feeling like I have to choose one thing over another, that I can actually get to work on a lot of different things. That doesn't mean I get paid for all those different things or that people are going to hire me for all those different things, but actually just allowing myself and giving myself permission to play around with different things and sort of follow my heart in terms of curiosity is a really great part of what I do.
Amazing. Thank you so much. All right. And that's something that we've been highlighting in SciComm story times generally, is that there's all these amazing different approaches that you can take to highlighting science or doing whatever you'd like in your career. I mean, we've had people, again, that come from such a wide variety of backgrounds. So for kids, especially that might be having trouble in school with science, if you're fascinated with it, stick with it. There's lots of opportunities to, have that curiosity and passion rewarded and justified in the biggest of ways. All right, we're going to take a few more questions. Lily, you have your hand up on Zoom. That's fantastic. So I'm going to unmute your mic. If you want to have a question, go for it.
How and when did you discover your interest and love for science?
Yeah, great question. So as I said, I wasn't really very interested in science when I was a kid. I didn't dislike it. I just wasn't very interested in it because I loved art and I loved playing around with art. But for me, the big moment was when I emailed NASA and they actually said that they would be interested in talking to me and interviewing me for a job. And so my realization that I liked science came a bunch later when I was a young adult. But for me, it was realizing that I could actually contribute and help NASA, even though I had gone to art school. And so this is what a lot of what I'm trying to hopefully share with all of you, is that I didn't learn until later in life that I could go to art school, but still be interested in NASA at the same time. And had I known that earlier, I think I would have been doing even more interesting stuff earlier in my life. And so for me, the thing that really interested me about science initially was learning that that I was of value, that even though I wasn't a scientist, that I had things to help scientists with, that I would be considered smart and useful to science, even though I wasn't a scientist. So that was what really changed it for me, because I think everyone is interested in different sciences, but not everyone knows that you can actually do things in it if you're not a full-fledged scientist. So that's always something to keep in mind, and also the other way around as well. So if you want to become a full-fledged scientist, that's awesome. You're going to do amazing work, but just know that you can also get a job in art one day later on if you want to. So it goes both directions.
Yeah. I love two messages from that. One is this idea of, again, there's so many different careers within fields, whether it's NASA or whatever field you're interested in. NASA researchers, and we have a lot of NASA engineers in our program, they always highlight that if you want to be a business person or a lawyer or a cook or an artist, there are jobs for you at that organization. And that's a fantastic message to share. And this idea of emailing people. So you got this incredible opportunity to email someone you're passionate to talk about and got a job out of it. And so for kids especially, if you're keen on something, don't be shy. Don't feel that someone is above you or that they won't want to respond. Most people are curious and they love helping out people that are keen on it. So make sure you guys do that. All right, quick question from Cal. How cold is it in the tube under the water, Ariel?
Okay, so I didn't actually measure the temperature, but as I was saying before, the wind in Antarctica dictates really how cold it is everywhere. So when you walk out onto the sea ice and you go into the tube, the benefit of the tube is that a lot of times it can be at least slightly warmer than it is outside because there's no wind. So even though you're in this cold metal tube in the middle of the ocean, because there's no wind, it's actually a little bit warmer than it is outside. And so they actually don't even let you wear your huge parka coat when you go down the tube because it's so skinny. They don't want you to get stuck. So you can wear like a sweatshirt down in the tube and you'll be okay.
Maybe they discovered that from personal experience and you can follow up your space book with like weird things that have happened to people in Antarctica title. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot of stories.
I'd buy that book. All right, let's go to Lilia and then we'll wrap up with Evangeline in a minute. But Lilia, if you have a question, let me just demute Mike. Okay, so Lilia, you should be good to go. Go for it.
If microscopic creatures live in cold places, do they live in very hot places too?
Yeah, absolutely, they do. So microscopic creatures just live everywhere, and some of them are tiny animals like the tardigrades and rotifers that I was showing, and others are even tinier like bacteria. But it's interesting because they live both in cold climates and in warm climates. But it seems that in cold climates, fewer of those tiny creatures are able to survive because it just requires a lot more hardiness to be able to live in such a cold environment. So the interesting thing when it comes to Antarctica and climate change and talking about a warming planet is that there might be over time more microbes who are able to live in Antarctica, which means that tardigrades and rotifers and other creatures down there will have more competition. So they'll have sort of these WrestleMania battle fights going on as more creatures are able to try and take a foothold in Antarctica and challenge them to their home. But microbes are able to really just live everywhere. They live in the atmosphere, they live deep underground. And the thing that's important to remember is that even though we can't see them and some of them might be scary looking, there's so many of them that are really adorable, like tardigrades and friendly. And so like with anything else, there's good apples and bad apples when it comes to microbes. And there's just an entire, zoo of animals that you walk by every day. And I really like thinking about that.
Yeah, the analogy of WrestleMania continues your trend this whole presentation of having me smiling so much it hurts my face. So thank you for that. It's it's a good sign when that's part of the presentation. All right, Edie, I'm going to come to you. If you want to ask your question, you're unmuted. Go for it.
Yeah. How small can you, what's the smallest you can see with your microscope?
Yeah, great question. So this microscope behind me is kind of like a standard microscope. It uses light to shine through organisms. So when I was showing those pictures of tardigrades, the reason why they look transparent is because I'm shining light through them. So this sort of microscope can see bacteria, but it can't see, for instance, viruses. Viruses are incredibly small, and you can't actually see them with a light microscope like this. You need a much more powerful microscope. But this sort of microscope can see everything from tardigrades, which, as I said, might be a third of a millimeter to an entire millimeter in size, down to bacteria, which are significantly smaller. So light microscopes are able to see quite a bit. So I would say the majority of microbes that you think about day to day, this microscope can see them, but viruses, this microscope wouldn't be able to see it.
And for those of you who might not have a microscope at home too, go in your backyard with a magnifying glass or just with your eyes and look at the insects and amazing creatures that you'll find in your backyard. That's what inspired me to get into science as a little kid about your age, is finding about 75 species in my own backyard. So I encourage you to check that out as well. And it's spring, so there's lots of new stuff coming out as well. Ariel, this has been fantastic. Before we wrap up, because we have more questions than we could possibly cover in one session, could you repeat again some of the cool sites and places we can send kids to learn more about you and your work and dive in with the stuff themselves?
Yeah, so a lot of the topics and stuff, if you want to learn more about microbes or space exploration or Antarctica, the best place to go would be my YouTube channel. So that's youtube.com/Ariel Waldman. That's ArielWaldman. And so you can get a lot of great videos there. And I'm putting out new videos every Wednesday morning. So that's a continuous thing you can check out. The other things I mentioned earlier were things like lifeundertheice.org, which is a virtual microscope where you can check out all sorts of microbes on your own and share them with friends. And then otherwise, I am Ariel Waldman on all social media. arielwaldman.com is my website. So really, if you just search for my name, you're going to likely find a lot of different things that you can check out. But probably my YouTube channel is the best thing to check out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ariel, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And what we do at the end of every broadcast, and this should get really loud if this all goes well, if everyone joining us wants to demute their microphones and join me in saying a huge thank you to Ariel. You are all good to go. Thank you so much. Go for it, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Everyone, we'll see you all soon. Check us out on SciComm story time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.